Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L'Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
Today, as we record, it is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and there's a lot going on nationally and globally around fighting for things that we believe in, fighting against things that we don't want to see happen, changes that we don't like and that we're really wanting to speak out against or speaking for something. And we want to bring it in more to the personal level. As coaches, we work with our clients on how they see their best life or how they want to be and what they want to focus on. And if there's something in our lives that we want to change, or we feel like there's something that's not working, or we are facing a challenge in our life, as coaches, we can ask those questions, those questions that get to our values. And also one thing that comes to mind is non-negotiables, things that we just will not compromise on. And so that's where this conversation is going to go today. When I think about this particular topic, one thing I think about is, and this kind of goes to about conflict. And I think when we are engaged or we engage conflict, at least for me, values comes up. Often when conflict arises, it can be around differing values or a perceived difference in value. So that's one thing that I really think about when I think about conflict and when I think about shaping the life that I want to live, shaping a meaningful and purposeful life. The things that come up for me are values. Like, what do I value? What's important to me? And one thing that I have been contemplating or exploring is how I have changed as a person in just having new experiences and being in a different leadership role and experiencing different things, like going from academia, going from university, where I would say my experience is quite insular. I was very much focused on my classes, my goals as a teacher, what I wanted my semester to look like. And there were some intersections where I would collaborate with colleagues, where I would be aware of myself in a bigger system. But there were so many times in my academic life as a teacher where I was very much just focused on myself. And I wasn't really, and of course my students. But now in this leadership role that I'm in, it's much bigger. And there's so many different layers and there's so many different paths that I can take as a leader, that the people come up to me and they have ideas about certain things. And one thing that I'm learning in this experience is, one, aligning myself with the mission and the vision of the organization that I work for and that I represent, and also reconciling that with my own values and my own idea of how I want to show up. And then it's not just in work, but it's also in other aspects of my life. I'm part of a larger organization, the Rotary Club, and there's so much there as well in terms of Rotary International, and then our own club, and then myself, and really reconciling all of those different similar and different agendas, ideas, visions, missions, those type of things. And then how does that all come together? So Eryn, what are some thoughts that come to mind as you're listening to me kind of contemplate or go through the ideas here?
Just the rootedness of values for how they show up in your own life in particular, and how they relate to your professional life is so robust and profound. And, we get to see that through the mission of the organization that you lead, supporting families in the community. So I think that just naming that and sharing that aloud feels good to me too, to support a friend and their journey in this new role. And so that really kind of just was sitting with me a little bit, just like listening to you come into this role and really align with values. So I really love that. The other thing that came to me was I tend to do things a little bit too quickly. I mean, this dates back to as soon as I could walk, really, in grade school when my art, my second grade teacher's like, "You're rushing in art. Why do you rush art? It should be fun, right?" And it's just part of who I am. But on the other end of that, one of the things that slows me down is going back to values. And so I think that's really important looking at the new year. You know, there's the year of the horse coming up that's going to take us along pretty quickly. And I think as part of that, we have that inner wisdom to also hold that slowing down space and hold that space for letting our values show up. The other thing that you said at one point, it was something to the it was something about how our values can often be similar, I think, but we're still in conflict around them. And that is really true in so many ways. And this past Sunday, so yesterday, I led the whole church service on a workshop around listening well, asking effective questions, and giving feedback. Now, as a caveat, again, I shouldn't have rushed because giving feedback needs to be its own separate piece of this. And we ran out of time. I wasn't, to be honest, necessarily expecting like that much engagement, which was really good. But also, I wasn't really listening to the values at the end or to my own intuition. It's just like, okay, we got to get through this to move into the next thing. And so I think that's one critique I have of my own self and facilitating this workshop. But on the other end of it, there were a lot of positives. And the positive for people to practice listening and then for the person speaking to the listener to be uninterrupted for a period of time. I got so many people saying how that felt so new and they weren't used to that, and having that opportunity to share without being interrupted or without giving advice. So it's kind of like that suspension of holding off interruption, holding off giving advice. And then when we ask effective questions as coaches, right, we're also not trying to lead necessarily to here are the next steps right away. Here's what we're doing. We're really sitting in that space with the client to unravel their values, to unravel how that relates to who they are, who they want to be, how they want to show up. And those questions then can inform how to move forward. And again, leading that part of the workshop, it was a really good reminder for people to not go straight to advice giving or straight to what do we do next? What should you do next about this? And I think that when we can hold that space in daily conversations and just practice those skills, which are, foundational coaching skills, but are really human skills. When we can do that, we provide space for others. And I really like that concept of how that ties to us and our values, and how by allowing that space to be held, we then can interrogate our values and bring them to the forefront with a little bit more humility, grace, understanding, which then leads to this other piece of engaging conflict finally. We can then engage conflict in a different way. And it's kind of like a paradox in a bold way that's not bold, right? In a way that society doesn't want us to, because they want us to feed on conflict. And so I don't know, there's so much there. And I think this goes back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of nonviolence and love, and his embodiment of that, I think, just really perpetuates so many different circles and so many different people, and it gives light and understanding for those values to come to the forefront.
Yeah, I love how you brought in the concept of slowing down, giving space, listening. Those things, I think, in the way that things seem so urgent or rushed, as you were saying, like just kind of doing things too fast, or not giving it the amount of time that you would like to give it. One thing that came to mind when you were talking about that is the idea of slowing down, and how pacing and giving more time to things that have more weight or that are more complicated than we then originally thought, or that need more space and more time to process and to explore and to discover. I think those are things that came to mind as you were talking, Eryn, about one, it's exciting that people were so engaged in the conversation, which is great. It means that it's something that is important to uh, the people in your congregation, which is great as well. As well, having engagement, I think, is is like 90% of our work. Is we want to make sure that the people that we're working with are engaged, right? Because if people are not engaged or they're checked out, it's difficult to move forward or to do anything. So just the fact that you had the engagement, I think that's really great. And I'm curious to know, in the conversation, the idea of listening and, giving that space to really hear what people are saying and listen to what people are saying, and the feedback that you were getting from the people who participated in that activity, that's not something they were used to. And one thing that I'm curious to know is, in that activity, was there anything that, besides that wasn't something they were used to, is there anything surprising that you saw or that they noticed about the experience? Was there a chance to like reflect on that? Because I know you said that it was a little bit rushed.
I think the reflection was really cool around having the space to talk for 2 minutes without being interrupted, because that was
Mm-hmm.
part of the exercise. And just the awareness that brought to the person speaking to be
Mm-hmm.
heard. It
Mm-hmm.
almost was like, wow, I don't get heard this way typically. And then on the other end, the listener to have a level of restraint and understanding of what's going on with them internally so they can listen well. And I think that section went really well. Just as an aside, if anybody's doing a workshop with 60 plus people, just I started with the partnered practice with that. And then we moved into 4 different larger groups for asking questions. And I really like how that showed up in the space around asking questions, because it really showed how different each group's questions were. Yes, they might be getting at something similar, but to me, that was such a pivotal moment. And I wish I would have highlighted this, and I hope we can highlight it moving forward to show like when we are in these conversations, there's so many different directions they can go. There's so many assumptions that can be made. And it really just depends on the individual you're interacting with to ask an effective question for the conversation to take a whole new life turn that can be incredibly insightful and life giving. And I think that is a theme that I wish I would have, spoken to more, because some of these groups came up with some really cool questions, really effective questions. One around how they're nourishing something. And I don't know, there were some really good questions from the groups. So I think that this is practice, right? So we get to sit and practice and we have the space to practice. So then the question becomes, how do you bring that into your everyday life and relationship to your values? And, and specifically this kind of framing of values and purpose and meaning making in our lives, to truly listen not only to each other, but listen to the life giving source of what's guiding us behind the scenes too. So I don't know. There's so much there. There's so much richness. And what I love about just this idea of connecting values to listening and asking questions, this goes back to fundamental skills as a coach, but also fundamental skills that can really change how we engage conflict in the world. And I think that maybe we can head in that direction by using these skills, doing conflict differently.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really stood out to me was the idea of the role of the speaker and the listener in that activity, and how the speaker was given that 2 minutes time, and how the listener had to give that 2 minutes time and really be present. I know I've done those activities before, and I can say that when you have an intentional activity like that, my experience has been that it does give you the opportunity to really be present with the person who's speaking, in those 2 minutes, you actually have to set aside your own personal agenda and listen to the other person. And that 2 minutes really gives you the chance to focus in on what that person is saying and then also make sense of what that person is saying. Because I think often in conversation, we are listening or we are hearing what someone is saying, and there might be something that they say that makes us think about something that we would like to say as well, or something that is important to us or something that is meaningful to us. And then we lose the rest of what that person is saying because we got kind of hooked on that one thing. And so when you have that 2 minutes, because 2 minutes is a pretty good space of time to listen, you can come back into the conversation or back into that person's train of thought or that person's line of thinking. And I think the more that we practice giving each other space to talk and space to listen, the more connected we can be. I think that allows for connection. And that's what I experienced when I when I participated in a similar activity. It really does allow for connection, and the time to get to know someone and or start to understand where they're coming from, or to have a clear picture. And then from there, if you go to the questions, and I think that could be one of the reasons that you had such rich questions that came out of that activity, because if you're really listening, you really do start to have more questions about certain things. And from there, that leads to more questions and more questions and deeper questions. So again, that comes back to the connecting, because one of the things that you said, Eryn, in the last episode about conflict and the piece about Jesus responding with a question, and the tactic of responding with a question is results in connection. And going back to like values and also intention, like if we enter into conflict or we engage conflict with the intention to understand and connect, that does change how we engage conflict. Because if we're entering into conflict with the intention to connect with our fellow humans, with the intention to learn more, it lends itself to deeper learning and a greater possibility that an understanding can be reached, or that the relationship or the partnership or whatever can improve or be. I mean, I kind of struggle with this, because one thing is there's a tendency to want to resolve conflict, and there's a tendency to want to make everything all right, I guess is one thing that I'm thinking about. But then there's a lot of power and value in sitting with what is, even if it's uncomfortable. Because I think if we rush to make it all right, or we rush to resolve something, things can be missed. And I'm not exactly sure what things can be missed, but I do feel like, kind of go back to what you said about rushing or kind of going through something without really giving it time and space to grow, or time and space to like process something. So that's one thing that's coming to mind, is that what do we miss when we rush to conclusions or we rush to resolution when we're not ready for that, or there's something that's not completely resolved, and then so that festers, and then it comes up again, and then it's a rush to resolve in the way that you think it should be, but there's that one little thing that's not being addressed, not being seen. And what is it? What do you think, Eryn? What are some of your thoughts? Like, what are some of the things that we miss when we rush through things?
Well, I like this idea of not giving too much direction. And I tried to hold that space for these exercises to see what would unfold in some ways. And that can be uncomfortable, the ambiguity. And sitting with the ambiguity can be even more uncomfortable, but that uncomfortable can lead us to more robust insights than if we had clear direction and knew all the steps and those sorts of things. So I think that's what you're saying, and I'm really feeling into that piece, because it really relates to this training in a lot of ways. So we miss a lot when we rush because we miss the opportunity to be uncomfortable and we don't like to be uncomfortable. I think personally that's one of the reasons I rush, and I never even thought about it that way till this conversation. I just want to get things done and not work through the uncomfortable parts and just move forward. And this idea of conflict being a part of that process and always kind of being there can feel uncomfortable in itself. But when we notice it, I think that allows us our opportunity to sit with that uncomfortable piece and learn and grow and make truly uncomfortable strides really toward our deeper selves, our the deeper meaning that we hold here and the work that we can do here to live out our values and live out our best lives. So that's what was coming up a lot when you were talking. And then towards the end, when you were speaking, I really started to think about this idea of giving feedback. And giving feedback is truly an act of care. And I brought this up in the conversation, I think maybe even last week, and then also in the training, but it's one of the hardest pieces for me in particular, between listening, asking questions, and giving feedback, to do well. And I'm not a fan of like a scripted model of feedback, because it really loses the authenticity, which loses the love and the connection for the other individual. But I am a proponent of giving feedback with care and being direct and clear. Now, as some people who kind of have circular thinking in ways like I do, sometimes I may not be the most clear and just like give feedback. And at the end of the day, as long as there's, thought and care behind it, I think it makes a lot of sense. But we walk around in our world constantly getting feedback from the earth, the seasons, the whatever it may be, stoplights, for instance, but we get very little feedback from humans. It is very rare that a human will say, "Hey, I noticed you did this thing. I thought it landed this way. I wanted to share that with you." How many times do we share that feedback with care? And maybe it's me growing up in the Midwest where you don't do that at all, really, kind of thing. But that piece of engaging feedback as an act of care and love towards someone, I think is so helpful. It can be really hard though, especially for people who are high engagement with conflict. They like conflict. It's part of even their academic upbringing, whether they're in, not to stereotype, but like in law or something. Like there's both the academic piece and then a personality kind of aptitude toward it. And so that's where I struggle the most when I'm engaging someone like that, because I just completely fawn and not want to engage the conflict, because I don't want to then offer some piece of feedback or advice for it to just kind of like be ripped apart kind of thing. So I think that's a big challenge. It's a challenge for me. It's a challenge from other people I know in my life. So I'm curious about like, how do we work with that? How do we work with giving feedback in those high conflict scenarios? But even at the most basic level, giving feedback to our closest friends and family, and being very clear and kind. And it's a topic that I think could use more space. And then in the coaching context, as a coach, we give feedback, but it's rare. It's more asking questions and listening, and potentially giving feedback. And we tend to give feedback rather than advice regardless, but it's just also something that me as a coach, right, I rely more on the asking questions and listening. Yeah.
Yeah. So much came up for me as you were talking. One thing that came to mind about feedback was understanding what that is. Like, what is feedback? And it being a act of care, it's an act of kindness, and how one can use feedback as a means of connection as well. Because when you are giving feedback to someone, you are, one, signaling that you're paying attention. Two, you are signaling that you care, because if you care about this person, you care about your relationship, you care about how they're showing up and what impact they're having, that you observe or that you see them having on yourself or others. Being able to share that with them, whether it's positive or negative, it's information that someone can use, and it's information that is difficult to come by on our own.
Yes.
It's information that we need from outside of ourselves. We have our own blind spots and we have our intentions, but very rarely, unless, you know, it's like a physical reaction, or then again, that would be feedback too. It's difficult to really understand or to notice the impact that you have on others, especially if you are focused on your intention, or you're focused on your vision, or you're focused inward. Feedback allows you to look outward and then also get that information from the people around you that are part of that vision, or they're part of that community, or they're part of that project that you're working on. And that could just be, you know, feedback from a loved one, or it could be feedback from a colleague, or it could be feedback from a client. That's a really important piece that we need in order to develop, as you know, our personal development. It's so important. And because it's so important, there's definitely value in giving time and space to that, really thinking and talking about what is feedback, how does it show up in this work environment, how does feedback show up in this family, how does the feedback show up in this friendship. So being intentional about it with the people that you spend your time with, that you have key relationships with, I think would be a really great exercise to have with your friends, with your loved ones, with your colleagues, people that you interact with on a daily basis or regularly. So I like the idea of feedback and where that comes in. And I do kind of feel like that's like a separate conversation altogether, where we could like talk about feedback, how it shows up in coaching, how it shows up in the work environment, because feedback with evaluations and that kind of thing, how it can be very formal and structured, and at the same time informal, authentic, and organic as well. So I mean, I'd love to delve into that, but as we are getting close to the end of our time, I want to like kind of circle back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy and what he stood for, and the idea of civil disobedience, something that I think warrants some time and reflection. So what is civil disobedience, and what is that is a type of feedback to society, to the government. What you are doing, I disagree with what you are doing. I believe that what you are doing is wrong, and I'm going to show you that it's wrong by not engaging. And I'm not going to engage in a peaceful way. I'm going to sit where you say I shouldn't sit. I'm going to stand where you think I shouldn't stand. And those are things that come to mind for me in terms of feedback. I do feel like our right to protest, to peaceably assemble, those are tools that we as a democratic society have. And I do see that as a form of feedback. How do we engage in the conversation about the intention there? Like, what is the intention? And is it effective? And how can it be more effective? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about on a macro level and on a national level, and also just in terms of this being MLK Day, you know, and just wanting to, and all the things that are going on currently, thinking about feedback and thinking about how we use it as a tool for communication with powers that may not be listening, you know, and how do we influence change, or how do we affect change through civil disobedience and through that form of feedback that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did such a good job at. Any thoughts, Eryn? It's kind of tangential.
No, it's so meaningful, and I really appreciate you making the connection of feedback and how we give feedback collectively through different acts that can make a difference. And so I was thinking about it at a very kind of individualistic one-to-one level, and so I love that you brought that back out to a much larger picture. And I think it's just leading me to a coaching nugget of wisdom really around feedback because it's such a powerful tool and such a hard one to use and to engage. And so, my coaching nugget of wisdom is for you to try this week giving feedback when you typically would not give feedback to somebody else in a conversation. And it doesn't have to go perfectly. Keeping in mind the feedback is coming from a place of care and love, and see how that goes for you.
I'm going to add to your coaching nugget of wisdom, Eryn, and ask the question about what does feedback look like to you and how does it show up in your life? What forms of feedback work for you? What forms of feedback turn you off? And what forms of feedback have you used that you have seen work? And what forms of feedback have you used that you would like to get feedback on in terms of the impact that it has on the people that you care about the most?
Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm L'Shawn with Mayshell's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.